So the object of this tutorial is to discuss um, margins and something called grids, and to show you how to manipulate margins and start grids in your InDesign documents. The goal is to set you up so that you can create a safety margin around your art on your spreads for next week's final, and to use that safety margin, that area around the edge of the page, to help you, remind you rather, to keep important elements like your type and text, and important parts of your illustration, not necessarily every part of your illustration, but important parts of your illustrations, to keep them give them a little bit of air between the edge of the page and themselves so they don't get crowded. All right, so let's take a look. This is going to be supported by a handout that went out today as well. So look for this handout that I'm showing you right now. And the instructions for how to do the traditional way of messing with your layout, with your margins and columns, is to go to the layout tab in the menu and go to margins and columns. You can also do this in the new document panel, and I'll show you that shortly. We'll get into it, but this is a basic way of one of the basic ways to mess around or change and edit your margins and column guides. All right, so the function of margins, we sort of take them for granted, but they're an important part of design, and they can help make a page look more inviting, or they can be used in order to pack the page with more information. That's a typical way of magazines and periodicals, that pages are money, so they're trying to stuff as much as they can on the least amount of paper as possible. And so the margins tend to get thinner in things like a Time magazine or Newsweek, that sort of thing. But it is not the friendliest way to do a layout. That lack of white space around your type can be off-putting. So this example at the top here is just a little too tight, and would be, I don't know, a bear to read. There is also wide. Wider is elegant. It's more inviting. The type, feels, it draws you into the type. But it can be impractical because you might not have, you can't sacrifice this much space, and you need the space for your content. So there's a balancing point between, when you're dealing with text, there's a balancing point. And I'm showing you text because starting next week, this will be more of a concern with you guys, because you will be starting to set up documents to have columns of text, because that's the next step. And our final step for the semester is to deal with text as a design element. And that will involve columns and grids and all that. So there is some functions for margins. We talked about sort of an aesthetic element of margins, and also a little bit practical in the sense of fitting more information on the page. But there's some other practical reasons that margins exist, and that is when you're holding a page in your hand, you want to have enough margin that your fingers do not actually cover any of the content that needs to be seen. And for folks who are, there's a long tradition also with books, and today with textbooks and perhaps workbooks and that sort of thing. Having a wide margin allows an opportunity to put notes on the page, to scribble notes, and that can be, there's a long tradition of that. If you go back and you look at a lot of old books, you'll see that a lot of people over the ages have used the margins of their books as a place to put notation, to make corrections if they find something in the text that's incorrect, or put their thoughts down in the book that they're reading. And in the case of textbooks, you get to mark up your textbooks and you'll need some room maybe to make some notes. So there's a practical reason for a margin as well. Let's see here. The grid. Okay, so the grid is a design phenomenon that grew out of the mid 20th century, post World War II. It is associated with Switzerland, which was doing a lot of, a lot of important design at the time, and they developed a system where it was considered modern, and it was getting away from. It's called an international style as well because it using modular or grids to create space on page, to create a sort of a skeletal system in order to organize pages, was something that sort of transcended nationality. Every nation had their own sort of way of approaching design. This one sort of took out all of those old traditions and just looked at the page and started dividing it up logically and elegantly, and with this, some aesthetic concerns that are a little more calculated, and again, I said logical. So every page, when you open up an InDesign document, is already set up for a 1-column grid. There is a simple 1/2 inch margin that goes around all sides of a page, and that is the default, and that is a 1-column grid. So without even knowing it, you have a 1-column grid. For that matter, when you open up and start a document in Google Docs or Word, you are also faced with a 1-column grid. That is the traditional, straightforward, out of the box grid. And that's what I want you guys to do for next week for your final ABC book, is to manipulate your already existing 1-column grids, one on one page, one on the other page, and probably make them not a 1/2 inch because that's default, but create that margin of safety margin that will help remind you not to put stuff in the wrong place or to have anything stray too close to the edge of the page and risk getting cut off in the cutting processes, or more likely just feeling a little too nullified, or just blocking the flow of air or space around it by just getting too close to the outside of the page. So this 1-column grid, we call them columns, these vertical squares or rectangles rather, we call them columns when we refer to them. And this is a 1-column grid, and as you add columns, you get to call them 2-column grids, and then multi-column grids. They don't have to be necessarily even in their width. They can be asymmetrical column grids. This is a 2-column asymmetrical grid. As we get more and more complex, we get to the multi-column grid, and then you can get to a stage where you've got something called a modular grid, where we're also concerned about dividing things into rows and into columns. And once you start doing that, you can create more complex page structures. And the point of a grid is it creates a unity from page to page, or design to design. It helps align things and keep things part of a skeletal system that's lying underneath. It's not going to print, but it's there for you to view because you create these guides in InDesign. In the old days, the artist would just, with blue pencil, trace all of these boxes and rectangles and rows and markings and these guidelines onto their pasteboard, and they would use that, and they would lay tracing paper over it and use that as a structure for them to lay their columns of text and photos and other objects and whatnot on the page. So it's been around for a long time. It's some people hate it, but it's super influential, and it is still in strong use nowadays, especially with web pages and that sort of thing. Okay. And we can see it gets more complicated here, and then it can get to be super complicated. Let's get even closer for really high functioning periodical page design, where you are setting it up to handle just about any situation that might come up. So this might be for a magazine or a newspaper, or or some other manual or something where you're just going to have a lot of elements potentially floating around and you want to have a system to keep things aligned. These systems also make designing a lot easier because once you've set up your grid, then it's very easy to come into a new page, draw text boxes and align them to the grid and fill them with text and have them all line up and start at the same point, line up on the top, line up on the bottom, have the same distance between each column. And also in the case of this one, to know how high your images might be, how much room you might have for these little captions to go under the images. But I also should mention that it's not as rigid as it might look, because if someone had an image, say on this bottom here, these two guys here, they had a larger image showing a wider shot, they could take an image and stretch it across both of those columns, or even if necessary, go all three columns if they had an image that needed to do that. So there is some flexibility in these in modular and in other grids. All right, let's see here. And a final note, when you're dealing with, well, not exactly the final note. Actually, I wanted to show you one thing else. It's on it's on the pasteboard. I wanted to show you that this is not just for multi-page documents with text blocks and things like that. Grids were originally very much behind all those posters I was showing you guys in the hierarchy project, where the international style, the Swiss style, was the inspiration for those type only designs. Those constructed, clean looking designs that I was showing you guys for examples in how to relate your type and how to do hierarchy rather. They have these structures underneath them that help align things. So that can be used for posters, it can be used for advertisements, it can be used for a number of things if you want to keep things consistent and you want to create a system under which everything can get lined up. So that's a grid, can be a lot of things. And some of those grids get pretty wild. They have angles, they have circles, they get very into the grids. So I just want to let you know that there are other options. And another little side note, when I'm referring to columns of text, the space between columns of text is also called a gutter. That might confuse you. It did confuse me at first, because aren't we calling the spine of the book or the fold a gutter? That is a gutter as well. The gutters that are between columns of text are also sometimes called alleys, but InDesign calls them gutters. And I'll show you about that when I start a new document. So let's do the demo part of this presentation. So you can mess around or customize, adjust, manipulate your margins when you start a new document. So let's start a new document and look at the new document panel. Once we get in here on the right sidebar, you'll see that I've already got it set up for an 8 by 10 inch page, which is what you guys should be doing. I've already got it set up to have two pages. And I've already got it set up to start on page number 2, so I don't have a cover, one of those loose first pages that's floating at the top. I've got facing pages on, but what we want to focus on is that I'm adjusting the margins here. So I'm thinking that, I mean, you could go as low as maybe a quarter, but I think that might be just a little too close to the edge of your page. You want to make sure that in this case, for this particular design, that you are using a uniform, consistent border or margin rather. So 0.75 is probably too deep. 0.5 is the default. So let's just go with a 0.4 or a 0.35. 4. I think that is going to be safe to say. You'll see that as I make these changes, it changes on my document. And you can see that leaves kind of a comfortable, but not too wide outlining margin around everything. And it applies to both of the pages. All right, so I'm going to create. There you go. So I've started a document. I've got my margins have been customized. My margins have also got, I've also created a grid just by doing this. These are 2 1-column grids. If you ever want to do something to your grids, I'm sorry, to your margins while you've got an open document that's already got something, you can go up to layout and margins and columns, and you can make adjustments here. Here's where I might show you that this is also where you control columns, and you can add as many columns to your overall grid as you'd like. You know, the more complicated grids might have 16 of these. You do not need to do that. That is way over. If you find that you are centering things on your pages, you might like to have that marker in the middle just to remind you where the center of your pages are. So do a 2-column like that. The gutter can be controlled here. You could make it that narrow and just have a line down the center of your page, or at least the center of your grid, your margin. It might not be the center of your page depending on what you're up to. Be careful when you're making your gutter between your 2 columns that it's not so thin that if you are running 2 columns of text next to each other, that the first column bleeds into the next column and people get confused when they're reading. We'll talk more about that when we're dealing with text. All right, okay. So this is a starting point for you to do your layout. It gives you a safety margin so you can remember to keep things away from the outside of the page, and also be mindful of your gutter, that you know you've got to be careful what you're laying over your gutter. So anything really important, small text, that sort of thing, will be at least this far away from your gutter. Let's look at an actual example. It'll think about it. Let's let my InDesign ruminate a little bit. Ooh, it is really thinking about this. Well, no one likes dead air. Oh, there we go. All right, so using this image provided by Breena Brown from, I believe, last year. Right now, I'm looking at this, and the type. This is not her type. I'm just using her image and taking advantage of the situation so that I can show where an example where type is getting too snug with the edges of the page and where a safety margin might come in handy. I also happen to feel that the top of his head, he's an important element, this character. And he is, by the way, just so you don't get too creeped out about this, it is kind of creepy. This is supposed to be making some fun of Twilight. So this is the point where the vampire comes in and hangs out to protect / watch his the girl he likes in her bedroom, which is just a little creepy. And that was sort of the premise behind her book. So it's a supernatural creep, not an average everyday creep, just so you know. All right, so we're a little too close to the edges. I want to make sure that we're applying a safety margin. Let's hit the W to see what the margin is right now. The margin is, let's see if it's what I would normally set it up as. It's 0.5. So again, that's a little bit, that's going to cut in on our available space a little bit more. So let's just make it 0.4 like we did in the other. I'm not going to worry about a centering thing right now because it's an asymmetrical design. Don't worry about columns. And I'm going to say, okay, that'll work. Now, the first thing, luckily, she has allowed or left enough image that we have a little bit of image to bring it down and get his head closer to the top. We're sacrificing some bleed on the top, but she's got a little extra than she needed for her bleed. All right, so that already right there is going to keep him a little more distant from the edge of the page. He was in danger of having the top of his head cropped off during the binding process of this book. But the rest of the stuff is still too close. I'm going to hit the W again so we can see our safety margin. And so some redesigning and maybe some scaling must be done here to fix this. So let's move some stuff down to start with. Not that, actually, I'm going to lock my, I'm going to try and lock my image. Actually, I've got it on its own layer, so it should be easier to do that. Okay, now I can't mess with it. So let's grab some stuff and get it out of the way. The S, we want it to be a little bit lower. And I think I'm just going to center it and get a little bit closer to the thing, a little overshoot, see if that we can live with that. Is for, where's that going to go? Let's try and tuck that in there. Things a little snug. Gonna close up. Oh, wrong place. Get that a little closer. All right, that's a little snug. A little snug. All right, but sneaking is too close and it's too wide, so sneaking is actually going to have to get a little bit smaller. There we go. Is it centered? Yeah, it is centered, so that shouldn't be a problem. Let's center all this as well. All right. But this line of, this is also, we got some trouble here. The girl, I'm going to put in some soft returns. Is absolutely not romantic. All right. And instead of centering it to the grid, I'm going to use it, I'm going to center it under my sneaking, because again, this it's a little asymmetrical because of these objects that are all over the gutter. And we're centering it in a space, not necessarily in there. I just want to make sure that my sneaking is not. All right, so that's, it's getting everyone away from things. I'm going to close, now that I'm going to close, I want to see it without all the guides and everything to actually look at it with my eyes. Let's move this down a little bit. Let's net this stuff really snug. Watch her sleep. That's soft return in there. And all right, so now we can kind of snug that up there. For is for, that's a little close there. All right, maybe S comes over a little bit. There we go. Now the S feels a little close to the roof. We have a little bit of room if we select all of this, I think, once that. And now we're not really paying attention to that guideline. We're just using it as a reminder. And now we're not lining up with it. We're actually going to line up things more visually in the, and actually give it a little bit more space. And I'm going to make sneaking just a tad smaller so it's not getting too close to that mirror on the wall. All right. And let's center these guys using the cement, and we're going to go up to the control panel and center those over each other using some of these aligning tools that come up when you're selecting things with the selection tool. And I think that might work. So that border is not being violated by anything too important. We've got a nice space around everything. I might still want to make the sneaking a tad smaller because I do feel like it's getting a little bit snug with that mirror. And then when I make that smaller, I need to bring this up a tad and then do these guys down a tad to open up that space. All right, I've got to stop now. No, I'm not going to stop. I can't stop myself. Now I'm going to move it over to the bit to the left. So it just feels a little bit more like it's in that space and comfortable. I'm not sure about this big gap here, but I think it's better than it was beginning with. It's got air. It feels like it owns that space. All right, guys, that's what I wanted to show you. If you have any questions, please contact me, and thanks for watching.